It was a crisp October morning in Providence. One of those mornings where the air carries both a chill and a quiet kind of clarity. The kind of morning that reminds you how precious time really is. I remember walking into my courtroom that day feeling reflective. At 84 years old, I had presided over thousands of cases, seen thousands of faces, and shared countless moments that taught me more about humanity than any law book ever could. I didn't know it then, but that morning would mark the closing chapter of my life's work and my final lesson from the bench. The courtroom was already buzzing when I entered. My staff greeted me with their usual warmth, smiles that spoke of respect and routine. The gallery was full, as it often was. People had come from near and far, some from other states, just to sit in that wooden chamber and witness what they called a Caprio's court of compassion. Some were there for tickets or fines, others just to see if kindness could truly exist within the walls. I took my seat, feeling the familiar weight of the robe settle over me. The sound of shuffling papers, the creak of benches, the gentle hum of whispered conversations, it all felt strangely comforting, like an orchestra I'd conducted for decades. I adjusted my glasses, glanced down at the morning docket, and smiled. Nothing unusual stood out. Parking violations, minor offenses, the usual rhythm of civic life. Just another day, or so it seemed. Then the bailiff approached. "Your Honor, this is the last case of the morning," he said. "A shoplifting, a loaf of bread, a loaf of bread." Those words lingered. Something about their simplicity struck me. I nodded, motioning for the defendant to be brought in. The heavy courtroom doors opened and a hush fell over them. Through them came an elderly man, slow and deliberate in his steps. He leaned on a makeshift cane carved from a tree branch, worn smooth by years of use. His clothes were layers of faded fabric, patched and repatched so many times that they had become a collage of survival. But it wasn't his age or his clothes that drew everyone's eyes. It was what followed behind him, a rusted shopping cart, draped in a blue tarp, wheels squeaking faintly against the polished floor. I could feel the shift in the room, the quiet murmur of curiosity mixed with something deeper. People stared, but not unkindly. There was something sacred in his presence. He stopped before the bench, resting both hands on his cane. "State your name for the record," the clerk announced. "Edward Patrick Sullivan," he replied, his voice gravelly but steady. 84 years old, I thought to myself, the same age as me. I glanced down at the case file. The charge was simple. Shoplifting a loaf of bread valued at $2.49 from Murphy's Corner Store. On paper, it was nothing, a minor infraction. But looking at him, I knew this was not a routine case. There was something written on his face that told a story far beyond any report or police note. "Mr. Sullivan," I said gently, "you're charged with shoplifting, specifically taking a loaf of bread without paying. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," he said softly. I took it. I was hungry. The honesty in his voice hit me like a quiet bell. There was no defiance, no attempt at excuses, just truth, simple and painful. I put my pen down, a small gesture, but one that always marked the moment when the law met the heart. "Well, Mr. Sullivan," I asked, "can you tell me about your circumstances? Why were you unable to pay for the bread?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning the courtroom, perhaps unsure whether to reveal his truth in front of so many strangers. Then he spoke. "I've been homeless for 8 years now, Your Honor. I live on the streets. Try to find work when I can, but at my age, jobs are hard to come by. Most days I get by on what I can find. But that morning I hadn't eaten in 2 days." The courtroom went still. You could feel every heart in that room sink a little. "Mr. Sullivan," I asked quietly, "may I ask your age?" 84, he replied, straightening his back slightly. Then, with a faint smile, he added, "Same as you, I believe." It stopped me cold. For a moment, I wasn't the judge, and he wasn't the defendant. We were simply two men, born in the same year, shaped by the same world, yet standing on opposite sides of fortune. I couldn't help but wonder how easily our roles could have been reversed if life had made just a few different choices for either of us. "Indeed," I said softly, "we are the same age." I studied his face. Weathered, yes, but not defeated. There was dignity there, and something else too. Pride. "Mr. Sullivan," I continued, Did you serve our country? He nodded, eyes glinting faintly. Yes, Your Honor. United States Army. Korea, 52 to 54. Vietnam, 68 to 70. 2 tours. A veteran. I felt something stir deep inside me. That old reverence I always felt when I looked into the eyes of someone who had worn the uniform. Thank you for your service, I said, my voice heavy with meaning. He bowed his head slightly. You're welcome, sir. And that's when I noticed it, the way his hand never left the shopping cart. He held on to it as if it were an extension of himself. A lifeline, something precious. As I watched him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this man carried more than just his belongings in that cart. He carried stories. Memories, maybe even ghosts, but I didn't know yet that inside that cart lay something so sacred, so profound, that it would stop time itself in that courtroom and become the single most powerful moment of my entire career. At that point, I only knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another case. This was a story, one that demanded to be heard, one that would test the boundaries of law, compassion, and what it truly means to be human. And as I looked at Edward Sullivan, this proud, hungry, homeless veteran, I realized that maybe fate had saved the most important case of my life for last. The air in the courtroom was still almost reverent, as if everyone understood that this was no ordinary case. The clerk sat quietly, the audience leaned forward, and even the officers at the back of the room softened their posture. You could sense that everyone felt the same thing I did, that we were standing at the edge of something deeply human. I looked again at Mr. Sullivan. His eyes were distant, but not empty. They carried the weight of someone who had seen the world at its brightest and its darkest. A man who had once been strong, proud, and necessary, now reduced to explaining why he had to steal a loaf of bread to survive. Mr. Sullivan, I began softly. You mentioned you served in the Army, Korea and Vietnam. That's quite a long service. Would you tell me a little about that time? He hesitated. His hands tightened on his cane, knuckles pale against the wood. Then, after a deep breath, he nodded. Nodded. I enlisted in 51, he said. Wasn't even 20 yet. His voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. After that, I stayed in the service, made a life of it. Got married, had a daughter, Susan. Thought I'd give her the kind of childhood I never had. But when Vietnam came, they called me back. I didn't hesitate. I figured that's what men do. They go when called. As he spoke, I felt a deep ache in my chest. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. The generation he belonged to believed in sacrifice, in service without complaint. They carried the burden of wars most of us only read about. What happened after the war? I asked. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry decades of disappointment. When I came home, things were different. My wife had gotten sick. Cancer. Took her before her time. I tried to raise Susan alone. Worked as a mechanic for years. But when the factory shut down, the pension went with it. I moved from job to job. Then one winter I got hurt, slipped on some ice, busted my hip. Couldn't work steady after that. He stopped to catch his breath. And in that silence you could almost hear the story between his words. The slow unraveling of a life once stable, once full of purpose. I tried to get help from the VA, he continued. But the paperwork, the waiting, it just wears you down. You start missing appointments. You stop checking mail. Before you know it, you're sleeping in shelters or under bridges. You tell yourself it's temporary. But temporary becomes years. He gave a faint, almost embarrassed chuckle. A funny thing, Your Honor. I fought for this country twice. But sometimes I feel like I came home to a place that forgot I ever did. Those words hit like a hammer. The courtroom was silent. I could see tears welling up in the eyes of people in the gallery. Even the young officer at the door shifted uncomfortably, looking down. I leaned forward slightly. Now, Mr. Sullivan, when you went into Murphy's store, were you alone? He nodded. Yes, sir. I was hungry. That morning, I'd walked 5 miles to the food pantry, but it was closed. I sat outside for an hour, hoping someone would show up, but no one did. I walked to Murphy's, and I saw that loaf of bread on the shelf. I thought if I could just have something to eat, I'd be all right. Just enough to get through the night. He paused, swallowing hard. I didn't mean to steal. I wasn't trying to cheat anyone. I was just hungry. His honesty was disarming. It wasn't the kind of plea that begged for mercy. It was simply the truth. It was simply the truth. The raw kind that makes you reevaluate everything you believe about justice. I looked down at the police report again. It noted that the store owner had caught him just outside, that he hadn't resisted, hadn't argued. In fact, it said he had apologized immediately and offered to return the bread. The officer who arrested him even noted that he had seemed frail and remorseful. When I finished reading, I looked back up. "Mr. Sullivan," I said quietly, "what's in that cart of yours?" He turned slightly, looking at the blue tarp behind him. His lips trembled. "That cart, sir, that's my home. My everything." He reached for the edge of the tarp and lifted it slightly. Inside were folded blankets, an old photograph in a cracked frame, and a small folded flag, the kind handed to a soldier's family at a funeral. He caught me looking at it. "That's my wife's flag," he said softly. "From when she passed, I carry it everywhere. Reminds me that I had a home once, and someone who loved me." In that instant, the courtroom was no longer a place of law. It was a place of humanity. Every rule, every statute, every precedent seemed to fade into the background. What remained was a man, not a criminal, but a soul weathered by life's storms, standing before me with nothing left but a memory and a folded flag. I took a slow breath. "Mr. Sullivan," I said, "thank you for your service and for your courage to stand here today." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I thank you for listening, Your Honor." And as I sat there, I realized something. Perhaps this wasn't just his story. Perhaps this was our story. A mirror held up to a society that too often forgets the people who built it, fought for it, and sacrificed for it. That day, I began to see the case not as theft, but as a message. One that demanded to be heard before I ever picked up my gavel. When I looked at the loaf of bread listed in the police report, I couldn't help but feel the weight of irony. It wasn't just an item anymore. It was a symbol. $2.49. That was the price of what brought an 84-year-old veteran into my courtroom. But what that bread represented was worth far more than money. It represented hunger, not just for food, but for dignity, for acknowledgement, for compassion. As I glanced at the case file, I could see the store owner's statement attached. It was a short paragraph, factual, emotionless. The subject took one loaf of bread and exited without paying. I called the police immediately. He had done nothing wrong. By law, he had every right to report a theft. But the law and what is right are not always the same thing. I looked back at Mr. Sullivan standing there with his worn clothes and weathered hands, gripping that cane like it was the last piece of stability he had in the world. His eyes weren't pleading. They weren't angry. They were tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of carrying more than your share of life's burdens. "Mr. Sullivan," I said softly, "do you understand that what you did was against the law?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "I do. I wasn't proud of it, but I was hungry. I didn't think it would come to this, being arrested at 84 for a loaf of bread." That sentence lingered in the air. Arrested at 84 for a loaf of bread. There are phrases that haunt you, that echo in your conscience long after the courtroom empties. That was one of them. The prosecutor, a young attorney, stood to speak. "Your Honor, while we respect Mr. Sullivan's service and situation, the state cannot ignore theft, regardless of the value. The law must apply equally to everyone. He wasn't being cruel. He was doing his job, upholding the law. And yet, the moment he said equally to everyone, I felt something inside me stir. Because equality under the law is one thing, but justice, true justice, is something deeper. It requires us to see people as more than the sum of their mistakes." I turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor," I said gently, "do you believe that this man, who served his country in 2 wars, who risked his life for our freedoms, deserves the same treatment as someone who steals for profit?" The young man hesitated. You could see the question working its way through his conscience. "No, Your Honor," he finally said quietly. The courtroom was silent again. Even the air seemed to still, waiting for what would happen next. I turned back to Mr. Sullivan. "You know," I said, "when I was a young boy, my father used to tell me something. He said, 'Son, you can follow the letter of the law and still break the spirit of justice.' I didn't understand that as a child, but I do now." Mr. Sullivan nodded slightly. "Your Honor, I never wanted pity," he said softly. "I just wanted a chance to live the rest of my life with a little peace." I didn't mean to cause trouble. He paused, then smiled faintly, his voice trembling. "When I took that loaf, I thought about the boys I served with, How many times we shared rations when one of us didn't have enough. We looked out for each other. Maybe I thought just for a moment that the world still worked that way. Those words, "the world still worked that way," struck me like a lightning bolt. Because that was exactly the question that this courtroom had to answer. Does the world still work that way? Do we still look out for one another, especially for those who gave everything so that we could live free? I took a deep breath and looked down at my bench where the law book sat neatly stacked. Pages filled with statutes, rules, and precedents. They guide us, yes, but sometimes they also blind us. Blind us to the faces behind the cases. "Mr. Sullivan," I said at last, "the law says you're guilty of theft. You admitted it, but justice, the kind of justice this court stands for, demands more than punishment. It demands understanding." He looked up, confused but hopeful. "So," I continued, "I find you guilty, but I also find you worthy of mercy." The room exhaled. The room exhaled. You could feel it, a collective release of tension, as if everyone had been holding their breath. I leaned forward. "This court will not fine you. You will not serve jail time. Instead, I'm going to ask the people of Providence, the community you fought for, to pay that debt in kindness." The young prosecutor looked up, surprised. "Your Honor?" "Yes," I smiled gently. "This court will cover the cost of that bread and more. Mr. Sullivan will not walk out of this courtroom hungry again." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The store owner, the same man who had filed the complaint, stood up from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "if I may, I'd like to withdraw the charge. I didn't know who he was. If I had known." His voice cracked. "If I had known, I'd have given him the whole loaf and a hot meal." Mr. Sullivan looked back at him, stunned. The two men locked eyes, one ashamed, one grateful. In that glance, forgiveness passed silently between them. And I realized something profound. This wasn't just about a loaf of bread anymore. It was about what the bread meant. It was a symbol of hunger, of dignity, of shared humanity. The law said it was proper. But to Eddie Sullivan, and perhaps to all of us watching, it had become something sacred. That day, the courtroom didn't just witness a ruling. It witnessed redemption. And as the bailiff closed the docket, I looked at that old loaf of bread and thought, sometimes justice isn't about what's fair. It's about what's right. The courtroom that day became something far greater than a place of law. It became a sanctuary of humanity. As the echo of my final words faded, there was silence. A deep, reverent silence that said more than any applause ever could. People sat motionless, some with hands clasped, others wiping tears they weren't ashamed to show. The law had just stepped aside to make way for something higher, compassion. I remember looking out over that crowded room, seeing faces transformed. A young mother held her son a little closer. A police officer, the same one who'd arrested Eddie 3 nights before, was staring down his own badge, as if reevaluating what it meant to serve and protect. Even the clerk beside me, who had seen thousands of cases, had tears in her eyes. It was one of those rare moments when everyone in the courtroom understood, not intellectually, but spiritually, what justice truly means. I turned back toward Eddie Sullivan, who was still standing at the bench. His eyes, once tired and dull from years of struggle, now shimmered with something that looked a lot like peace. He tried to speak, and his voice caught in his throat. So he simply nodded, a humble gesture that spoke volumes. "Thank you, Your Honor," he managed finally, his words trembling. "Not just for this, but for seeing me." That line, for seeing me, struck straight to my soul. Because isn't that what every human being wants? To be seen, to be known. Not as a number on a docket, not as a case file, but as a person, with history, pain, and hope. As Edie turned to leave, something remarkable happened. The young prosecutor who had argued for equal application of the law stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice soft, "thank you for your service, and for reminding me why I wanted to study law in the first place." Edie shook his hand, smiling faintly. "You're a good man, son. Don't ever lose your heart in this place." The audience, ordinary citizens, lawyers, even officers, began to applaud softly. It was for the spirit of compassion that had just unfolded before them. And that's when I realized this small courtroom in Providence had become a mirror of the world we could be, if only we chose empathy over judgment. After court adjourned, I sat alone at my bench for a long while. The sound of shuffling papers and closing doors faded into quiet reflection. I thought about Edie's shopping cart, that rolling memorial of 437 names and faces. I thought about how that cart, which most would have dismissed as the possession of a destitute man, was in fact a sacred vessel of remembrance. Then I thought about how, in his own way, Eddie had been doing what the justice system is supposed to do, preserving the dignity of the forgotten. Later that afternoon, as word of the hearing began to spread, something beautiful happened. Social media posts flooded in from around the country. Veterans shared their stories. Strangers asked how they could help. One local bakery announced it would provide free bread for any veteran in need. The news stations replayed the footage: an old man, a judge, a shopping cart, and a moment of humanity that transcended rules and headlines. Within 48 hours, donations began pouring into a fund to help Mr. Sullivan get housing. A group of local veterans volunteered to help him organize his memorial collection properly, to preserve the photographs and letters in a way befitting their importance. The city, inspired by what had unfolded, began working with nonprofits to expand veteran outreach. All of that from one loaf of bread. When reporters asked me about it, I said what I truly believed. The law can instruct us, but compassion transforms us. Because that day, Eddie Sullivan reminded the world that justice without compassion is just procedure, and compassion without justice is just sentiment. We need both. In the following days, I received letters from all over the world, from teachers, priests, students, even inmates. One letter stood out. It was from a retired police chief in Texas. He wrote, "Judge Caprio, I watched your hearing with Mr. Sullivan 3 times. I realized I've spent my whole career enforcing the law, but maybe I didn't always serve justice. Thank you for reminding me of the difference." That letter stayed with me, because I too had spent decades walking that line between law and love, rule and mercy, and I knew deep down that this case would be my last great lesson as a judge. The next morning, I arrived at court early. The halls were quiet, sunlight streaming through the windows. I passed by the bench, ran my hand over the polished wood, and thought about how many stories had unfolded here, how many lives had changed in this very room, but none quite like Edie. I thought about how justice, when stripped down to its essence, isn't about punishment at all. It's about balance, restoring the humanity that life sometimes takes away. And that's what Edie had done for us. He came to my courtroom accused of theft. But in truth, he gave something priceless. He reminded us that the measure of a society isn't how it treats the privileged, but how it treats the powerless. And then as I left that day, I paused at the door and looked back one last. The courtroom was empty, but I could almost hear the echoes of that morning. Eddie's trembling voice, the prosecutor's apology, the applause that rose like a prayer. And I whispered to myself that this is what justice was always meant to be. There comes a moment in every life, and certainly in every career of service, when you understand that your work is no longer about what you do, but about what you leave behind. For me, that moment came with Eddie Sullivan. I didn't know, sitting on the bench that October morning, that it would be one of my final days in this courtroom. I didn't know that the echoes of that gavel would be among the last I'd ever strike. But perhaps it was fitting that my final case wouldn't be about punishment or penalty, but about purpose. After Edie's hearing, I found myself thinking about him constantly. The image of his cart, those photographs, medals, and letters lingered in my mind. That cart was more than a collection of memories. It was a moving monument. Eddie didn't just carry those fallen soldiers. He carried their stories. For 70 years, he had been the custodian of forgotten bravery. And in that way, I realized he and I weren't so different. For 3 decades, I had presided over thousands of cases, and though I was called a judge, what I really tried to do was carry stories. Each defendant, each case was a person with a history, and my duty was to make sure that history was not erased by one mistake or one bad day. Eddie reminded me that compassion is the truest form of justice, because the law, for all its precision, cannot mend a broken heart, but compassion can. A few days after that hearing, I received a visit from a local reporter. She asked, "A judge, do you ever get tired of showing mercy?" I smiled. "Mercy isn't a task," I told her. "It's a privilege." And I meant it. Mercy doesn't weaken the law, it completes it. Without mercy, justice is just a rule book. But with it, justice becomes human. In the days that followed, I received word that Eddie's life had changed dramatically. Donations poured in from across the country. A group of veterans raised enough money to secure him an apartment. Local archivists began helping him preserve the collection of photos and journals. The city council even passed a resolution naming a day in his honor, 80 Sullivan Day of Remembrance. When I heard that, I sat in my chambers for a long while and smiled. That day in court had started with a loaf of bread, but it had ended with the restoration of a man's dignity. And perhaps, in a way, it had restored something in all of us. A week later, I received a handwritten note in the mail. It was from Eddie. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were powerful. Your Honor, I've spent a lifetime carrying the memories of my brothers. I thought that was my only purpose. But you showed me that maybe my story was part of theirs. Thank you for reminding me that compassion still exists in this world. I placed that letter in my drawer, beside the gavel I had used for 30 years. And in that moment, I knew I could retire in peace. My work was done. When I passed a few weeks later, my family told me that Eddie came to the funeral. He wore a clean suit, donated by a local veteran group. In his hands, he carried one of the photographs from his cart, a picture of a young soldier smiling in front of a tent in Korea. But this time he had added another photo beside it. Mine. He placed them together in his collection and said softly, Judge Caprio is one of the boys now. They say legacies are written in stone, on plaques, on buildings, in history books. But I don't believe that. True legacies are written in the hearts of those we touch. Mine, I hope, lives in the countless souls who walked out of my courtroom feeling seen, heard, and forgiven. Eddie's story became a symbol of that legacy. Because long after laws are rewritten and names fade from the record, compassion remains timeless. The power of understanding, of choosing to see someone not for what they've done, but for who they are. That's what endures. I often think about what I would say if I could speak to the world one last time. It would be this. Justice is not about judgment. It's about restoration. It's about bringing humanity back into the equation. Every person who stands before you, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, or a grocery line, is fighting a battle you may never see. So be kind. Lead with empathy. And when in doubt, choose compassion. Eddie Sullivan reminded me that a single act of understanding can ripple through generations. That a loaf of bread can spark a movement. That two 84-year-old men, one wearing a robe, one pushing a shopping cart, could meet by fate and change the world together, simply by choosing kindness. That was my final case, my final lesson, my final gift. And if there's anything I want people to remember, it's this. Justice is not confined to the walls of a courtroom. It lives in every small act of decency, every time we choose mercy over indifference, every time we lift someone instead of judging them. So let this be my verdict, not for Edie Sullivan, but for the world. Compassion is never wasted. Mercy is never weakness. And humanity, above all, is the highest law of them all.